The world first met Gypsy Rose Blanchard as a girl in a pink wheelchair. She was small for her age, her head was shaved, a feeding tube was often visible, and her smile seemed fragile. Her mother, Dee Dee, was always by her side. Dee Dee was the loving, devoted caregiver to a chronically ill child. She told everyone Gypsy had leukemia, muscular dystrophy, epilepsy, and a host of other serious conditions. She claimed Gypsy had the mental capacity of a 7-year-old. This was the story the world was told. This was the story that brought them charity, a new house from Habitat for Humanity, and trips to Disney World. It was a story of tragedy, but also of a mother's unending love. In reality, the story was a lie. Gypsy Rose was not sick, not in the way her mother claimed. The truth was far more disturbing. Dee Dee Blanchard likely suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a mental illness and a form of child abuse. The caregiver fabricates or induces illness in a person under their care. They do it for attention and sympathy. Dee Dee subjected Gypsy to years of unnecessary medical procedures. She had her daughter's salivary glands removed. She forced her to use a feeding tube and an oxygen tank. She shaved Gypsy's head to mimic the effects of chemotherapy, a treatment Gypsy never actually needed because she never had cancer. Every aspect of Gypsy's life was built on this foundation of deceit. Dee Dee controlled the narrative completely. She was convincing. She knew medical terminology and could fool doctors, nurses, and an entire community. When one doctor became suspicious, Dee Dee simply found another. She kept Gypsy's medical records scattered and confusing, making it difficult for anyone to see the full picture. Gypsy was a prisoner of her mother's delusion. She was taught from a young age that she was sick, that she needed her mother for everything. Her teeth rotted and had to be pulled out due to malnutrition and neglect, a side effect of the unnecessary feeding tube and medication. The physical abuse was relentless, but the psychological manipulation was perhaps even more damaging. Gypsy was made to believe she was fragile and dependent. Dee Dee controlled her daughter's perception of herself and the world. She would pinch or slap Gypsy if she said something that contradicted the narrative of her illness. The constant medical appointments, the surgeries, the medications, they all reinforced the lie. Gypsy's childhood was not her own. It was a performance carefully orchestrated by her mother for an audience that never knew the truth. It was a life lived in the shadow of a fabricated illness, a deception that would ultimately lead to a tragic and violent end. Dee Dee Blanchard constructed a world for Gypsy that was both a haven and a prison. Their pink house in Springfield, Missouri was a symbol of the community's generosity, a gift to a struggling mother and her sick child. But inside its walls, the reality was starkly different. It was a gilded cage. Dee Dee maintained absolute control over every aspect of Gypsy's existence. Gypsy was not allowed to go to school. Her education was limited to what Dee Dee provided, which was minimal and sporadic. This kept Gypsy intellectually and socially stunted, further cementing her dependence on her mother. It was a deliberate strategy to keep her daughter trapped. The isolation was profound. Gypsy had almost no contact with the outside world that wasn't mediated by her mother. She had no friends her own age. Any interactions with neighbors or community members were carefully supervised by Dee Dee, who would speak for Gypsy, often answering questions directed at her daughter. Dee Dee would tell people that Gypsy had the mental age of a child, an excuse to dismiss any signs of intelligence or maturity that might slip through. This constant surveillance ensured that the carefully constructed fantasy of Gypsy's illness could never be challenged. Gypsy was a ghost in her own life, visible to everyone but truly seen by no one. Dee Dee's control extended to the physical realm in extreme ways. Gypsy was confined to a wheelchair, even though she could walk perfectly well. This was one of the most visible symbols of her supposed disability. When they were in public, Gypsy had to play the part of a helpless invalid. At home, away from prying eyes, the rules were sometimes different, but the threat of punishment was always present. If Gypsy ever tried to assert her independence, even in small ways, Dee Dee's reaction could be swift and severe. The physical restraints were a constant reminder of her powerlessness, reinforcing the psychological chains that bound Gypsy to her mother. This life of confinement fueled a deep loneliness within Gypsy. She was a teenager, and then a young woman, with all the natural desires for connection, friendship, and romance. But those desires were forbidden. The world she saw on television and the internet was a world she could only dream of. Her life was a monotonous cycle of medical appointments, unnecessary treatments, and long days spent inside the pink house. The isolation bred a desperation for escape, a yearning for a life that was truly her own. It was this desperation that would eventually lead her to seek a connection in the only place she could, the hidden world of the internet. For someone as isolated as Gypsy Rose, the internet became a vital lifeline. It was a window to a world beyond the pink walls of her house, a place where she could exist outside of her mother's suffocating control. Late at night when Dee Dee was asleep, Gypsy would secretly go online. She created social media profiles, stepping into a digital space where she could be someone else. She could be a normal teenager. She didn't have to be the sick girl in the wheelchair. She could talk to people her own age about music, movies, and dreams for the future, things she could never discuss in her real life. This was her first taste of freedom. On these secret online accounts, Gypsy began to construct a new identity. She could present herself as healthy and able-bodied. She could post pictures that didn't show her feeding tube or her shaved head. It was a form of rebellion, a small but significant act of defiance against the fiction her mother had created. The digital world allowed her to explore who she was, or who she wanted to be, away from Dee Dee's watchful eye. It was a dangerous game. If Dee Dee discovered her secret online life, the consequences would be severe. The risk, however, was worth the reward of human connection. The anonymity of the internet provided a safe space for Gypsy to express her true feelings. She could voice the frustrations and the loneliness that she had to keep hidden every day. In chat rooms and on dating sites, she found a community of people who saw her not as a medical case, but as a person. She could flirt and form relationships, experiencing the normal pangs of teenage romance that had been denied to her. This digital life became more real and more important to her than her physical one. It was a world where she had agency, where she could make her own choices and form her own connections without her mother's interference. This secret life, however, was a double-edged sword. While it provided an escape, it also highlighted the stark contrast with her reality. The freedom she felt online only made her confinement feel more acute. The friendships and romantic interests she developed were a constant reminder of what she was missing. The yearning for these digital connections to become real grew stronger with each passing day. It was this intense desire for a tangible escape, for a love that could exist outside of a computer screen, that set the stage for the arrival of Nicholas Godejohn, a man she would meet in a Christian singles chat room. In 2012, while exploring a Christian singles website, Gypsy Rose met Nicholas Godejohn. He lived in Wisconsin, hundreds of miles away from her home in Missouri. Their connection was immediate and intense. Through messages and video chats, they built a world of their own. For Gypsy, Nicholas was everything she had ever dreamed of. He was someone who listened to her, who seemed to understand her, and who offered her the love and affection she had been starved of her entire life. He became her secret confidant, the one person in the world who knew the truth about her life and her mother's abuse. Nicholas Godejohn had his own struggles. He had a history of mental health issues, including a diagnosis on the autism spectrum, and had been in trouble with the law before. He saw himself as Gypsy's protector, her knight in shining armor. In their online conversations, they created a fantasy world filled with role-playing and alter egos. Nicholas had a darker side, a violent persona that he shared with Gypsy. This side of him, which might have been a red flag to others, was perhaps what Gypsy felt she needed. She was living in a desperate situation, and she believed she needed a desperate solution to escape it. Their relationship deepened over the course of 3 years, existing almost entirely online. They shared their darkest secrets and their most intimate dreams. Gypsy told Nicholas everything about her mother's abuse, the lies, the medical procedures, the physical and emotional control. She saw him as her only way out. He, in turn, promised to rescue her. He was willing to do whatever it took to be with her. Their conversations grew darker, moving from fantasies of a life together to concrete discussions about how to achieve it. The idea of freedom became inextricably linked with the idea of eliminating the one person who stood in their way, Dee Dee. The online romance was an intoxicating escape, but it was also a dangerous echo chamber. Isolated from the outside world, their shared fantasy grew more extreme. Gypsy fed Nicholas's desire to be her savior, and he, in turn, validated her belief that violence was the only path to liberation. They were two lonely people who found each other online, but their connection was built on a foundation of trauma and fantasy. The love story they wrote for themselves was not a fairy tale. It was a dark narrative that was spiraling towards a violent and tragic conclusion, a plan that would soon move from the digital world into the real one. As their online relationship intensified, the conversations between Gypsy Rose and Nicholas Godejohn took a dark turn. The dream of a life together seemed impossible as long as Dee Dee was in control. For Gypsy, every day was a reminder of her imprisonment. The abuse was escalating and her hope for a peaceful escape was fading. She felt trapped, with no legal or social recourse. She had tried to run away once before, but Dee Dee had found her and punished her severely, chaining her to the bed. This failed attempt convinced Gypsy that she could never get away from her mother while she was alive. The idea of murder did not emerge overnight. It was a slow-growing seed planted in the fertile ground of desperation and fantasy. In their secret chats, Gypsy and Nicholas began to discuss it. At first, it might have been just another dark fantasy, an extension of the role-playing they often engaged in. But as time went on, the fantasy began to feel like the only viable solution. Gypsy would detail the abuse, and Nicholas would promise to protect her. He would be her wolf, and she his angel. The plan was for him to come to Missouri and kill Dee Dee, freeing Gypsy so they could finally be together. They planned the details meticulously over several months. Gypsy knew the layout of the house. She knew her mother's routine. She would be the inside person, providing Nicholas with the information he needed to carry out the act. She saved up money that Dee Dee had given her to buy a bus ticket for Nicholas to travel from Wisconsin to Missouri. She would let him into the house in the middle of the night while her mother was asleep. She would give him the murder weapon, a knife from their kitchen, and then hide in the bathroom, covering her ears so she wouldn't have to hear what was about to happen. The plan was a testament to Gypsy's state of mind. After a lifetime of abuse and manipulation, her moral compass was skewed. She saw the murder of her mother not as a malicious act, but as a necessary act of self-preservation. It was the only way to end the torture and claim her own life. For Nicholas, it was the ultimate act of love and protection for the woman he believed was his soulmate. They were two damaged people, fueling each other's darkest impulses. The conspiracy they hatched online was about to become a brutal reality, changing their lives and the lives of everyone around them forever. In June 2015, the plan was set in motion. Nicholas Godejohn took a bus from his home in Wisconsin to Springfield, Missouri. He checked into a nearby motel, waiting for Gypsy's signal. The night of the murder, Gypsy and her mother had returned home from a doctor's appointment. Gypsy waited until Dee Dee was asleep. The house was quiet. The moment she had been planning for months had finally arrived. With trembling hands, she opened the door for Nicholas, who slipped inside under the cover of darkness. The fantasy was over. This was real. Gypsy gave Nicholas the knife from the kitchen and a pair of blue gloves. She told him her mother was in the bedroom. Then, as planned, she went into the bathroom to hide. She later recounted that she covered her ears, trying to block out the sounds, but she could still hear her mother's screams. The violence was swift and brutal. Nicholas entered Dee Dee's bedroom and stabbed her multiple times. For Gypsy, huddled in the bathroom, those few minutes must have felt like an eternity. It was the terrifying, irreversible climax of years of hidden pain and desperate yearning for freedom. After the murder was committed, Nicholas found Gypsy in the bathroom. The deed was done. They were free. Or so they thought. They cleaned up some of the blood and took several $1,000s in cash that Dee Dee had kept in a safe. They called a taxi to take them to Nicholas's motel room, leaving Dee Dee's body in the bedroom. For the next few days, they lived in a strange state of limbo. They went to the movies and were seen on surveillance cameras holding hands, acting like any other young couple. They were trying to create the normal life they had dreamed of, even as the shadow of their crime loomed over them. Their plan for what came next was hazy. They mailed the murder weapon back to Nicholas's home in Wisconsin, a decision that would later prove to be a critical mistake. They then took a bus to his house, believing they had gotten away with it. To create confusion and buy more time, Gypsy posted a chilling message on the shared Facebook account she had with her mother. One post read, "That bitch is dead." It was this post that would ultimately lead police to their door. The act that was meant to be their liberation was quickly becoming the catalyst for their downfall. The disturbing Facebook posts were the first sign that something was terribly wrong. Friends and neighbors who saw the messages, "That bitch is dead," and a subsequent comment about a fat pig, were alarmed. It was completely out of character for the sweet, loving mother-daughter duo they thought they knew. They tried calling and knocking on the door of the pink house, but there was no answer. Worried, they called the police to perform a welfare check. When officers entered the house on June 14, 2015, they found a crime scene. Dee Dee Blanchard was dead in her bedroom, lying in a pool of blood. Initially, the biggest concern was for Gypsy's safety. She was nowhere to be found. Her wheelchairs were still in the house, and her medications were left behind. The community feared the worst. They believed the sick, disabled girl had been abducted by her mother's killer. A frantic search for Gypsy began. The case drew national media attention, painting a picture of a helpless victim who was in grave danger. No one could have imagined the truth. The police, however, were already piecing together the clues that would turn the entire narrative on its head. The investigation moved quickly. Police traced the IP address of the Facebook posts to Nicholas Godejohn's home in Big Bend, Wisconsin. When a SWAT team raided the house, they found both Nicholas and Gypsy. To their astonishment, Gypsy was alive and well. Not only was she unharmed, but she could walk. She appeared to be a perfectly healthy young woman. The officers who found her were stunned. The girl who the world believed was a terminally ill child was standing in front of them. The entire story of her life, so carefully crafted by her mother, began to crumble in an instant. During questioning, the full, shocking story finally came out. Gypsy and Nicholas both confessed to their roles in the murder. Gypsy revealed the lifetime of abuse she had endured, the fabricated illnesses, the physical and psychological torment. It was a story so bizarre and horrifying that it was difficult to believe. But as investigators dug deeper into Dee Dee's past and Gypsy's medical history, or lack thereof, they confirmed the unfathomable truth. The victim of the abduction was, in fact, the mastermind of the murder. The case was no longer about a missing girl. It was about a complex tale of abuse, deception, and a desperate act of matricide. The legal proceedings that followed the arrests of Gypsy Rose Blanchard and Nicholas Godejohn were complex and highly publicized. The world was captivated by the twisted story. The prosecution was faced with a difficult case. On one hand, they had a brutal murder. On the other, they had a defendant, Gypsy, who was a lifelong victim of horrific child abuse. Her lawyer, Mike Stanfield, built a defense centered on the extreme duress and psychological trauma she had suffered. He argued that Gypsy was not a cold-blooded killer, but a desperate young woman who saw no other way out of an impossible situation. Given the extraordinary circumstances and the overwhelming evidence of abuse, Gypsy's lawyer negotiated a plea deal. In 2016, Gypsy Rose Blanchard pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. This plea acknowledged her role in planning the crime, but also took into account the mitigating factor of the abuse. The prosecution agreed to a lesser charge, sparing her a potential life sentence for first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison, the minimum sentence for the charge. For many, the sentence seemed lenient, but for those who understood the depth of her suffering, it was seen as a just outcome. Nicholas Godejohn's fate was different. His trial took place in 2018. His defense team argued that he had been manipulated by Gypsy. They claimed his autism spectrum disorder and diminished mental capacity made him susceptible to her influence. They portrayed him as a pawn in her plan, a man who killed out of a misguided sense of love and a desire to be her hero. However, the prosecution presented a different picture. They showed the jury evidence of his violent fantasies and argued that he was a willing and active participant who understood the consequences of his actions. The jury did not accept the defense's argument. They found Nicholas Godejohn guilty of first-degree murder. His role as the person who physically committed the crime carried more weight in the eyes of the law. In February 2019, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The two people who conspired to commit a crime in the name of love and freedom were now both behind bars, their shared dream of a life together shattered forever. The legal system had delivered its verdict, closing one chapter of the tragic story while opening another for Gypsy, a life in prison. On December 28, 2023, after serving 8 years of her 10-year sentence, Gypsy Rose Blanchard was released from prison on parole. Her release sparked a media frenzy. The world that had been fascinated by her case was now eager to see the woman who had emerged from behind bars. She was no longer the frail, childlike figure from her past, nor the inmate from the trial. She was a 32-year-old woman tasting true freedom for the very first time in her life. The challenges she faced were immense. After a lifetime of control, first by her mother, then by the prison system, She now had to learn how to navigate the world on her own. Upon her release, Gypsy embraced the public eye, at least initially. She rejoined social media, quickly amassing millions of followers. She gave interviews and participated in a documentary series, seeking to tell her story in her own words. It was an attempt to reclaim the narrative that had been stolen from her for so long. She spoke of her regrets about her mother's murder, stating that she wished there had been another way. She also spoke of her gratitude for her freedom and her hopes for the future, which included reconnecting with her family and building a life with her husband, whom she married while in prison. However, the glare of the spotlight proved to be overwhelming. The intense public scrutiny and the pressures of sudden fame were difficult to manage. After a few months, Gypsy made the decision to step back from the public eye. She deleted her public social media accounts, expressing a desire for privacy and a chance to live a normal life away from the constant judgment and commentary of strangers. This move signaled a new stage in her journey, a shift from telling her story to simply living it. It was a recognition that true healing and recovery would need to happen away from the cameras. Gypsy Rose Blanchard's story is a powerful and disturbing reflection on the nature of abuse, victimhood, and the struggle for liberation. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the failures of systems meant to protect children and the desperate lengths a person might go to when they feel they have no other options. Her journey is far from over. The road to recovery from such profound trauma is long and complex. As she navigates her newfound freedom, her story remains a haunting reminder of the hidden horrors that can exist behind closed doors and the enduring strength of the human spirit in its relentless pursuit of a life of its own.